Good afternoon. On behalf of the Office of Juvenile Justice and Delinquency Prevention, and in collaboration with the American Institutes for Research and the National Council of Juvenile and Family Court Judges, I'd like to welcome you to today's webinar entitled Lights, Camera, Action: How to Add Impact to a Webinar Presentation. My name is Linda Rosen. I'm a Program Manager with the Office of Juvenile Justice and Delinquency Prevention. As the OJJDP representative, I'm happy to introduce today's panelists. Each of their photos and bios can be found in the handouts pod on your dashboard. The panelists are Joyce Burrell, Project Director of the American Institutes for Research, and Jessica Pierce, Project Coordinator of the National Council of Juvenile and Family Court Judges. As you all know, due to budget cuts and limitations on on-site training and conferences, webinars have become more and more a means of conveying information across the field. They're popular, they're cost-effective, and they're able to reach large groups of people, actually worldwide, not just nationwide. Today's topic is intended to help you create webinars that successfully engage participants by being interactive and informative. Now let's hear from the OJJDP National Training and Technical Assistance Center. Michelle Duhartang will share with you a few features of the Adobe Connect. Michelle?
Thanks, Linda. Good afternoon, everyone, and thanks so much for joining us. I would like to take just a couple of minutes to discuss a few features of Adobe Connect, which will help you maximize your opportunity to participate in today's webinar. To view the bios and photos of the presentation panel, please access the Word documents, which are available now in the upper center quadrant of the webinar dashboard. You will see a pod that's labeled Handout. Please feel free to begin downloading all of those documents at your leisure. To send a chat message to me, your host, a panelist, or another attendee, click the menu icon in the upper right corner of the chat pod. Choose Start Chat with, then select Host, Presenters, or Specific Attendees. 2, type your message into the text box, which many of you have already done. And 3, hit Enter or click the message bubble icon to send. For those of you participating in today's webinar as a group, please take a minute and help us count. Go to the chat window and type in the name of the person registered and the total number of additional people in the room with you today. This will help us with our final count. Again, if you are viewing with a larger group, please type in the name of the person registered and the number of additional people joining you today. There will be 2 opportunities for Q&A throughout the presentation today. As questions arise, please send them to me, your host, to share with the panelists. During that time, we will take every opportunity to address some of the questions you have posted during the presentation. Additionally, there will be poll questions. Please take a moment to answer each of the questions, which will help us help you. At the conclusion of today's webinar, you will be provided with a link to take a 5-minute online survey about today's presentation. We appreciate your feedback regarding this webinar. The information is invaluable, and we use it to assist OJJDP in future planning and training. You will be able to access the evaluation link on the last slide of the PowerPoint. For those of you participating as a group, when you return to your office, please enter the link on the last slide in your web browser to share your feedback, which will be archived on OJJDP's Training Center at www.ntac.org in approximately 2 weeks. Again, thank you for joining us today. Linda?
The webinar objectives. First objective is to help you learn helpful tips on how to plan, organize, and run a successful webinar, to help you understand how to design and prepare a webinar, and learn how to engage your audience and create effective PowerPoint presentations. And finally, to review how to use your webinar software tools. I'd like to introduce at this time Joyce Burrell from the American Institutes of Research to give you the first portion of the training. Joyce.
Thank you for that. Welcome, and Linda and Michelle, thank you for the tip to open this webinar. I want to advance my slide. I know you've heard the old adage, a little planning goes a long way, and also prior planning prevents poor performance. Those two are as important in a webinar as they are in a live presentation. When you look at your audience and who you want to do work for, you have to decide who this is intended for and whether or not it's targeted to a particular group or if it's going to be designed for multiple audiences. So that helps you begin that defining of your audience. What is it that you want them to know, and what do you think that they really want to know? You also will often have topical information that you know they need to know. So you must decide while you're defining this audience the best way to deliver that information. And if webinar is the format that you choose, how you're going to communicate in the webinar becomes important. And then the last thing is, how will you decide whether or not your format worked for this population? You're going to schedule that webinar, you're going to select moderator and presenters, you're going to create your master timeline. So in defining your audience, what do you know that your audience will need to know to improve or guide their preparation for the webinar? And we're going to ask you to select between whether you're going to have special population who's attending, so will you need hearing devices? Will they need special keyboards? Are there any visually disabled people who will be attending your webinar? Planning for that is as important as planning for those who don't have disabilities. So would you mind? So 100% of you, 80%, over 80% have planned for folks who need hearing devices. All of you are either beginners or seasoned or advanced in delivering webinars, and a third of you actually have used the chat boxes. And that's continuously going up for that chat box. So that's very encouraging that you have been using webinars long enough and polling questions long enough that you find the chat box an effective tool. So determining the topic and how to title your webinar and selecting the format. The topic you choose is often not just your choice. Hopefully it's a brainstorming activity with you and others who are interested in the work. And a lot of times you're promoting a new concept. You're trying to help people to deal with issues or new regulations that they have to adhere to. You may be amending existing policies and you're trying to help develop procedures that make the practice easier for those who are participating with you. Keep the title, of course, brief. As you know, lights, cameras, action is catchy. You've heard other catchy titles like, here we go, fasten your seatbelt for the budget ride. Can you hear me now? To respond to issues that may have come up over time that you have drummed over and over and over again into your audience, but you now have examples why neglecting such issues becomes a problem for you. The format that you select, again, has to do with the size of your audience, the needs of your audience, and the best way to engage as many people as possible in what you're trying to do. At NTTAC and at the State Training and Technical Assistance Center, we try to use a rule of 3 for the number of presenters in a 60-minute or 90-minute webinar. Your audience is also a member, and ideally you would give as much time to your audience as you give to your presenters, so that if you have 90 minutes and you have 3 presenters, you have probably 20 minutes each to present, 20 minutes for your audience to be engaged with you, and then 10 minutes for those prerequisite kinds of things around logistics and the follow-up work that you do at the end of a webinar. So selecting the technology platform. You are really, really, really lucky in that the Adobe platform is available to all of us who work with OJJDP, and we can access it through the NTTAC website. The NTTAC team will work with you if you don't have your platform of your own. But the size of the audience again becomes important in selecting that platform. You want to make sure that you're managing the participants' questions as you move along, and managing those questions means often staffing the chat box so that those questions that presenters can answer during the presentation can be handled, but that you have a system for answering all of the questions and getting timely responses to your audience. Send early registration, but check it frequently to make sure that it has not been compromised in any way. We had a very interesting experience a few weeks ago with a webinar where someone had moved the registration to their site to be helpful, but then someone else hijacked it and connected it to a porn site. So it's really important to check from time to time to make sure, especially when you do early registrations, that no one has hijacked your registration screen. Post webinar documents and reports early, but save some things to be posted the day of your webinar. You want people to stay attentive if they can. You want to ask questions so they can be attentive during the webinar, but you also want them to have something to prepare, especially if it's a new topic or a new regulation or a new way to calculate numbers you're going to have to report to your grantor. So scheduling the webinar, and as you see, my 3 people are in the same time zone, but unlike those 3 people, NTAC, the STAC, and most of your webinars will be for people across the country and sometimes outside of the country. And so being sure that you choose a time where you can get maximum attendance usually means that you end up in the 4 o'clock slot or the 3 o'clock slot, and therefore accommodating as many people as you can. I see there are people on who do a lot of work with Guam and the Virgin Islands and Alaska, and so we've done webinars at 5 o'clock, 6 o'clock, 7 o'clock in the evening to accommodate those people, and therefore invite others who are not in that time zone to join for late webinars as well. So we have a polling question for you. And the polling question is, what is the best time of day to host a webinar? And I'd like for you to select, based on where you are, the best time.
Just so you know that some of the best practice research out there has some great ideas in terms of the best time. And remember the folks in Hawaii and in the 6 territories, they always want to be a part of the action at a time that's convenient for their workday as well. So I see some of you are still trying to make a decision about the best time today to host a webinar. It looks like right now 10 a.m. is trending.
And 10 a.m. is trending at a time when many of our registrants are from Oregon, California, Oklahoma City. So there may be a slight difference in their time zone, making 10 o'clock in California 1 o'clock on the East Coast. And that's a normal part of a consideration in planning for a webinar.
Kelly, I'm going to ask you to close the poll right now, and so we can see what the final results are. Okay, well, let me just tell you what the best practice is. The research is telling us 2 o'clock is the best optimal time of day to hold a webinar. The field says that 22% of folks are holding their webinars at 2 p.m. in the afternoon. The second best time, as you can imagine, is 1 p.m. and the third best time is 12 noon. So in the future, when you're planning, keep in mind 2 p.m., 1 p.m., and 12 noon.
Thank you, Michelle. Our next polling question is, when do you think most people register for a webinar? And we've had many discussions around the best time to send the announcement out. Is it 30 days before? Is it 1 week before? Is it the week of the webinar? Is it 2 days prior to a webinar, the day of the webinar, or none of the above? Most of you said 1 week in advance is time enough for you to register. 61% said a week in advance is good for you for registering for a webinar. So now your job is to select the moderator and the presenter for your webinar. In selecting a moderator, you want someone who knows the subject matter, of course, but you want someone who's able to introduce your speakers, who's able to facilitate in transitions, just as you heard Michelle join me as she gave you this data on the frequency or the best time for webinars. It is a normal role for a moderator to be able to come in during the process of delivering a webinar. Ideally, the research says that you should do something with your audience every 3 to 5 minutes during the webinar. So in this first 8 minutes of the webinar, we have introduced 3 polling questions that you've had the opportunity to respond to. When we select presenters, we really are looking for someone who is knowledgeable of the subject, who is passionate about the topic, and who has some understanding of how adults learn to anticipate differences of opinion about material presented. We have to have someone who's willing to engage in a strong dialogue from time to time about the topic that's being discussed. But most of the time, they're fairly general questions that are being asked, and your presenter will be able to answer them. If a presenter is not able to answer, it is important that you have a way to respond, that they will receive an answer to their question within a given period of time. I would remind you that NTTAC is always there to help you with logistics and issues that you may have around presenting, and there's tremendous expertise in this area to help you do professional webinars, to do webinars that are very impactful, and webinars that you will be proud to be part of. So your big job is to pull out that Excel spreadsheet and begin to create your master timeline. In creating your master timeline, you want to let each member of your team know what their roles and responsibilities are, what the roles of the presenters will be. Will one build on the work of the other? Will each introduce a different topic? What will your audience role be in your webinar? And who's necessary to support your team throughout the webinar? In scheduling the conference calls with your presenters, you want to make them timely, meaning you want to give them time enough to, 1, decide they want to be a part of it, 2, to talk about what it is that they can contribute to the webinar, and 3, an opportunity to practice the slides that they develop for the audience. You want to create specific submission dates for their pictures, for their biographies, and most of all, for the presentation itself. These presentations have to often be reviewed by the center you're submitting them to, but often to our federal partner or the client who has requested the webinar. And that gives time to get feedback to the presenters, changes to be made, or additions to be added. And then you go forward to schedule your practice sessions. Practice sessions should not just be logistics. It is critical, especially if you have not participated in a webinar with your presenter, that you have them actually present slides and that you get feedback from the planning team as to whether that's enough material, if it's too much material, but just so that it's just right for a presentation. Again, remember that rule of 3, and that being, try not to have more than 3 presenters in a 1-hour presentation, including your audience, and not more than 4 in the hour-and-a-half presentation. So here are the logistical musts for a webinar. You have to create that registration link. And again, I will say that NTTAC has volunteered as the coordinator of all the logistical work for the Office of Juvenile Justice and Delinquency Prevention to help you design or put up your registration link. You have to spread the word. And then you have to, in spreading the word, brainstorm with others the best ways to get it out. Social media has been a tremendous way to get the word out, but all of us have listservs that we use. All of us have friends and other presenters that we know that we want to help us get the word out. You have to prepare the resources that will support the work that is provided in a webinar. So you want to do that early, and you want to decide when you want to post that for your audience. Again, conduct rehearsals. Practice doing the sound checks. Practice using the microphone on the computer, making sure that talking into the computer is adequate, and deciding whether or not you actually need an external hearing device to help with the sound. Next slide, please. So creating the registration link requires planning as well. When should the form go out and who will launch it? Checking the numbers periodically to see how many registrants you have. Confirming with your registrants that you received their registration and what will be coming to them following their registration. If you find that you don't have many people registered for the webinar, send a reconfirming memo or send out another registration link to encourage them to sign up for the webinar. Approvals are always necessary. Your client may want to approve what you're sending out. Your own office may want to approve what you're sending out. And within your team, you want to be sure that what's in that announcement reflects what you expected to go out. Tracking the work is important. Track to see that you're not getting notifications kicked back in your junk mail. Making sure the mailer demon is not sending you comments that 100 of your participants did not receive this message, but you must check those because they're not going to automatically tell you to look in your trash can to see if your email is actually there. Look in your outbox to make sure it's not sitting in your outbox and that it actually went. So we have a fourth polling question. The fourth question asks you, do you gather feedback from your attendees following a webinar? And your three options, of course, yes, no, and no vote. And right now, 100% of you actually collect feedback from your attendees about the webinar. These are really great opportunities to learn what could improve a webinar or other information that you might want for future webinars. So it's great that we have a team of folks on the phone who actually use that skill. The next question is, how many webinars do you deliver during the first quarter of each calendar year? So between the first calendar year of how many? 1 to 3, 4 to 6, 7 to 9. If I were responding for my center, I would say that we do 4, but I don't know what the answer is for each of you, so I'm watching. Large numbers are you still thinking about how to plan and deliver a webinar. That's a fair response. And 35% of you do 1 to 3 webinars in the first quarter of each calendar year. And I'm making sure that I say calendar year to emphasize that we're looking at January to December and not the year of your contract. Okay, so I talked a little bit about ways to get the message out, spreading the word, and I specifically put in Facebook and LinkedIn because we get so many notices on those two social media outlets. But there are other social media outlets that are Twitter. Many people are using. I listened to a broadcast last night where they were actually taking interviews over Twitter. And can you imagine how short your resume would have to be if you were submitting a Twitter resume? But home pages of your websites are perfect places to promote webinars, and regular email newsletters and your HTML blasts. And I'm sure there are times, from time to time, you are sending blasts about other topics or other information that you want to get to the field. We talked about having resources earlier, but now let's talk a little bit about preparing those resources. Are you going to post on your website handouts? Are you going to post publications, articles? Are you going to reference books or white papers? And how soon you decide to make those available to the participants will give you some information about how involved your participants can be. If it's a new topic, please send articles ahead of time or white papers ahead of time so that they can be abreast of the concept you're trying to promote so that you get informed participation by your audience. And conducting those magical rehearsals. Schedule 2 to 3 if you can prior to your webinar. And as I said earlier, do a complete dry run of the presentation, especially if it's new material that's being presented to your audience. Go over your web conferencing tools with your participants, with your presenters, as well as with your participants. You will have presenters who are not familiar with all of the tools that your new platform might use. So share those capabilities. Let them try those tools so that they become comfortable with them too. Set up a presentation on a backup computer in case your computer crashes while you are doing the presentation. Stuff happens with the best of planning, and you really do have to keep that in mind. You can't freeze, you can't panic, you just have to move to the next step. Sound may fail for a presenter, his or her computer may fail. If the lines drop, you need someone with a backup computer to keep it going. Have your paper presentation beside you so that when you have a backup computer operating, you don't have to get up and move. You can just move right along on your paper document until your electronic screen comes back up for you to use. So now the wonderful day has arrived. It is your day on stage as the webinar presenter. In the background, you want to remind your registrants on that day, so you might send your last flash reminder to everybody who registered for the webinar. You might send it out to the original listservs that you sent it to a week before. Depending on the size of the webinar and the expertise of the webinar team, you decide whether or not you want your presenters online an hour before, or if 30 minutes before is appropriate. If you're repeating a webinar multiple times, which often happens, you may decide that for the first webinar, an hour ahead of the webinar is important, but for presentation 2, if presentation 1 was flawless, you may decide a half an hour is plenty of time to get them connected and to make sure their audio is up and their slides are moving correctly. Save the names and the emails of your registrants. This is very important if you want to send them material after the webinar and if you want to send them materials in the future. Once you start that recording, you need to have a screen up that tells them what you are doing. Suppose you are still loading slides at 2 o'clock and it's a 2 o'clock webinar. You want them to know that you're loading the presentation or you're loading handouts for them. So make sure you have something up on your screen at all times welcoming them and reminding them. Review always the housekeeping items for the webinar. And that is, again, how it works, what to do if you want to chat or if you have a question, what to do if you can't hear or if you're not able to see the screen. There's always technical support. But reviewing that for the participants, even the day of the webinar, is key to keeping them engaged and keeping them in the webinar. At the end of your webinar, make sure you thank everyone. Everyone for participating, everyone for presenting, everyone for sponsoring, and for cooperating with you throughout the webinar. Launch your evaluation or feedback form, whichever you call it. And of course, save the recording because you know you're going to want to post the webinar. And so you will need that recording. You'll need any questions that were asked and certainly the answers to those questions. And so we have one more polling question for you, I think. Okay. Next slide. So there is not a polling question, and so make sure that at the end of your webinar, you give yourself time to debrief your presenters. Your presenters will have incredible feedback that will help you in future webinars. Modify the audio recording as is necessary, and you know you have to do a 508 compliance transcript. Many of you participated in a webinar that NTTAC put on a couple of months ago on 508 compliance. Many of the people in our audience have disabilities, and we have to make sure that our webinars are accessible to them. So the 508 training is very, very important if you haven't had it. It does not take long, but it is on the NTTAC website and you can access it. Post your recorded webinar and the transcripts as soon as possible. Usually we tell people they'll be posted within a week to 2 weeks. And certainly the PowerPoints are available immediately if they didn't go out before the webinar. It's important to share evaluation or feedback summaries with your presenters, but it's equally as important to share with the field what you learned from the feedback that participants gave us during a webinar. So I hope that you got from this that planning is as important a step in webinars as it is in live presentations. A little planning goes a long, long way. The logistics for doing webinars is not impossible, but everybody needs to learn how to do them because you never know which role you will want to play or need to play in the delivery of a webinar. And then certainly we want to keep in mind the steps that we must go through before the webinar, during the webinar, and after the webinar. And this is your opportunity to ask me questions. Reeve?
Thank you for that, Joyce. Great job. Now it's your opportunity to take a deep breath. And I want to just share with each of you for just a moment that there are some great resources on the handout pod that I want to bring to your attention. If you have not taken an opportunity to download those, please do so. Those links are live, and it will allow you to download the documents right into your computer. A few of the things that I think may be of interest to you are a couple of books that Dave Perotti has written. Delivering Your Message with PowerPoint, 102 Tips to Communicate More Effectively Using Your PowerPoint, and as well as his book that he has written, Present It So They Get It. You know, oftentimes we say, if you build it, they will come. And the reason we spend a lot of time talking about the planning and the design of the webinar is because you could have the best presentation panel in the world, but if people aren't attracted to the title, the content, if you haven't spent a great time laying out a nice description so they really get a sense of what, how their time will be spent for an hour and a half, then they won't show up. So I hope that you are taking away some golden nuggets that will be very useful for you when you begin to plan your first webinar. So let's look at a couple of questions that have actually come in, Joyce, for you while you were presenting. One of the questions that have come about is, what are your thoughts on doing a pre-recorded webinar when you don't have a live audience? Have you experienced that, and if so, can you just share? And if not, what are your thoughts about it?
Actually, I have participated in pre-recorded webinars. And as you know, this is going to be posted, and you'll be able to hear the voices. You'll be able to participate in the polls after it's over. I like live webinars, but I think my life is live webinars, and I don't have the research on it, but my life webinars is akin to live webinars, akin to my past live presentations. So I don't have enough data to help you, but certainly we'll look up data and send that to you following the webinar. I am sure in the last 10 years, a significant amount of data has been collected that could give you a better answer to people's responses to pre-recording webinars.
Okay, here's another great question, which you maybe touched a little upon, Joyce, but maybe you can expound on what the research is telling us about what the right amount of presenters should be for an hour and a half webinar.
For an hour and a half, it's 90 minutes. You can have up to 3 presenters in your audience. So for me, that's 4 presenters. Ideally, you're going to have some introductory information and some logistical information at the beginning of your webinar that will normally take 2 to 5 minutes. You probably are going to have someone to introduce your webinar, which might take another 2 minutes. And then on the back end, you're going to have more questions than you built into your 20 minutes for your audience. And so you will easily use your hour and a half, not exceeding the 3 live presenters and the live audience participation.
Thanks, Joyce.
The other things that we would present for you after this is timeline, an example of a timeline. The question came from in the room, and it's a very important one. I was blessed to have a young staff person who used to say to me, just do a template. It meant nothing to me until she laid it out in a timeline that really had the time in for, when to contact presenters, what they had to present, what you needed from the client, when you ought to do that, when you need to send slides. So we will share with you a document that will help you with that. And I also know Dave Parati's books will help you with that. NTTAC also has a timeline that they use. And we will send you all of them, and you can choose which is best for you.
What they have. Joyce, if you would speak a little bit about the importance of a feedback form. Why people should have the feedback form, and what actually should they do with all that information that they're getting post each webinar they present?
Well, hopefully in planning the webinar, there was some brainstorming around the need for such a webinar or presentation. And then with feedback, you're finding out whether or not it addressed the needs of the audience you were trying to address. That it will tell you more about the audience's needs for future work in developing webinars. It'll give you feedback on what worked for them, what didn't work for them, if they want more that's interactive, less that's interactive, or if they have other ideas about how to interact. They may say things like, well, can we use a webinar where you do a few minutes of presenting and we go away and talk about what we're learning and we come back to the webinar. There are many, many things that we've learned from delivering webinars. And so that feedback form is the easiest tool. If you launch it immediately following the webinar, you'll get the greatest response. At least our experience is you get a greater response when you launch immediately rather than sending it a day or so after the webinar.
Thank you, Joyce. Thank you, Joyce. Now let's proceed with our next panelist. Great questions that are coming in. Please keep those questions coming. We'll have another Q&A segment following our next presenter. But Joyce, thank you so much for that very valuable insight to how to set up and plan a webinar. I think there were some really great tips that you shared, and I can already see, even though I can't see, folks taking some really great notes. So I'd like to introduce our next presenter, who is actually one of the resources in your handout pod. Jessica M. Pierce is the project coordinator with the Juvenile and Family Law Department, and there is a resource that she has on the handout pod called Online Trainings in You. Jessica is going to take you through some really interactive activities, and I think you'll get a lot out of the next segment. Jessica, take it away.
Okay, great. Thanks, Michelle. Can everybody hear me okay? All right, since nobody is saying they can't hear me, then I'm going to go ahead and think that yes, you can. All right, so I'm calling my segment, anything you can do in the classroom, you can do online, almost. I know that if you're like me, you might have spent a lot of your time doing online or doing in-person trainings. In fact, I've been doing in-person trainings for 15 years, and I really like it. I have a lot of tricks I use with the participants, a lot of tools that I like to use. And
just a second for her to adjust the sound.
All right, is that better? All right, so I'm getting participants saying I sound fine, but folks over on our presenter side of things aren't able to hear me. Is that what we've got going on here? Michelle, can you hear me now? Okay, great. They can hear me now. So, if you're like me, you've spent a lot of your time doing in-person trainings, and you probably have a lot of things you like to do with folks when you have them in front of you. And when they started talking to us about doing online training, we were a little bit resistant because we were really good at doing it in person. And so we had to get good at it. And that's the thing that I want to tell you is that with practice, like Joyce said, you can get very good at doing online trainings, and you can do a lot of the same things that you would do in the classroom online. What I'm going to walk you through now is part of actually a longer online training of trainers course that I developed along with Betty Gurnell and Sue Yeras. That was actually a 12-hour course for folks, and they got to do some of their own presenting and their own planning for slides and activities. We won't get quite that in depth today, but those are activities will grow out of what we're going to talk about today. All right, so online learning is going to replace face-to-face delivery. I think we're seeing this happening more and more for folks where we don't have the budgets to travel like we used to, and that in each state our participants don't have the availability to leave their offices to come to a day-long training, and people are doing more with less, which means that they sometimes can't leave for that length of time. So it's going to be very important for us to get good at conveying our messages in this electronic online format. A lot of the webinars you might have seen maybe are what I would call a plenary session webinar, where you have somebody who's talking and there's not a lot of opportunities for interaction. And what I'm going to be doing today is a little bit more like a workshop, where we're going to have a lot more interaction between me as the presenter and you as the audience. What Joyce did for us, I think, is a really great example, actually, of how to do that kind of plenary webinar and still keep it interactive. She did a nice job using the polls, and you were able to chat and respond and get some feedback from not only Joyce, but also from other participants, which is, like a large group discussion, really, which I know in the classroom is one of our favorite techniques. All right, we're going to talk about some of the navigation tools in Adobe Connect. And right now, all you can see is the participant view. When you use Adobe Connect, of course, on my end, I can see a lot of other things. I have a lot of other options for what to do. And one of those is turning on my cursor. And this is something you can do when you want to point things out in the Adobe Connect dashboard to folks. So you should be able to see my cursor now moving around the screen, and I'm going to come up here and I'm going to point to this person in the menu with their hand raised. The hand raised icon is a fun way to engage people that doesn't involve a poll. So I'd like to ask you if you've participated in an online training or webinar before. So if you could go up and select either the green check mark or the red X to indicate whether or not you've participated in a webinar. And this is a great tool to use if you have a large group of folks that's a little bit different than the poll, that lets them interact with you and gives you feedback about where your participants are. And this can work with, hundreds of people. Okay, we have a raised hand. Do we have other folks? So again, green check marks, good. Lots of folks have gone to webinars before. You'll also notice under that same menu that you have other icons that you can use, like an icon for stepping away. You can use the applause icon if there's something that a presenter says that you're particularly fond of. And so it's just, another way for your audience to give you feedback as a presenter or you feedback as the producer who's running the training. All right, next we're going to do a poll. And again, I say everything you can do in person, you can do online. So let me know if you have participated in a webinar that includes poll questions, a physical activity, an icebreaker, large group discussion, small group discussion, if you've had videos, or question and answer sessions. And please select all that apply. Okay, great. I'm going to show you the answers, and it's about what you would expect. A lot of us have done webinars where we've had poll questions. Question and answers are really common. Videos are a great way to get your point across so folks can see and have a different way to engage than just listening to a voice. I'm going to go ahead and turn off my cursor now because I don't want that to be too distracting to people as I'm talking. All right, my cursor is off, and we're going to clear everyone's status. And again, these are things that we can do behind the the scenes that make that are transparent to you as the audience, but that make it easier for presenting. And as you practice with these tools, you'll be able to do these things as well. All right, some people feel kind of uncomfortable with webinars. And they're not sure quite how to get in the spirit for them. And I think this is an icebreaker that's a good example of that. So everybody go ahead and at your desk or wherever you're sitting to watch the webinar, cross your arms. And we all have a way we cross our arms. For me, I put my left arm over the top of my right arm. And that's my way of crossing my arms. Now, try to do it the opposite way. So put your opposite arm over the other. And so now my right arm is on top and my left arm's on the bottom, and it feels a little bit weird. And I think for people who are not comfortable with online presenting, it can sometimes feel a little bit like that, like you're crossing your arms the wrong way. As you practice, though, you get good at it. You know, like if you're a fan of Star Trek and the live long and prosper salute, that's another thing that, again, when you practice, you'll get good at it. So this is something to think about as you're planning. If there's something you'd like to have people physically do, and it's something they can do at their desk, then feel free to incorporate that into your webinars. All right, here's an example of an icebreaker that you can do with folks. I've already showed you how to use the check mark and the X. I'd also like you to use that same tool to find the raised hand or the applause. So let me know what your favorite vacation is. If you like to go to Europe, select the green check mark. If you'd like to go to the beach, the red X. If you're a fan of cruises, although I'm not sure that many people are after the news recently, select the raised hand. And for camping, go ahead and choose applause. Okay, it looks like everybody's finding it. We've got people who are fans of a little bit of everything. Great. And at the same time as you're doing that, go ahead and chat in the chat box what you're looking forward to about learning about webinars. Okay, great. Thank you all for participating in my informal polling there. We're going to clear everybody's status out. And I see lots of folks are chatting. Great. And while you're doing that, while you're talking about what you're looking for in the webinar, I'm going to tell you kind of what we're going to do with my segment. We're going to practice and play with the tools, and we're going to learn how to apply learning-centered instruction to online facilitation and determine the best way to work with the facilitation tools to maximize, or facilitation team to maximize participant learning. You'll notice that this is not something that just I'm doing or just Joyce is doing. There's an entire team of folks that are working on this because you really do need a group of people to be managing your environment. And so a team approach is always the way to go when you're running a webinar. You don't want to leave your faculty feeling like they're out there just talking into space. You want them to feel like they have the support of you and your organization behind them. Okay, it looks like we have lots of folks who want to learn how to engage and keep people engaged. And how to keep them engaged for non-audio learners. Sabrina, that's an interesting question. And hopefully, when we talk about visuals, I'll be able to talk a little bit about that. And George talking about how to present specific topics. That's always interesting to figure out how to address your topic in a way that's going to be effective online. And the average size of the team that develops and manages trainings. Well, Jimmy, we normally have about 3 people that are doing something like this. So there's the presenter, there's the producer, who's Michelle in this instance, and then there's probably somebody behind the scenes who maybe is your IT person or the person you can go to with questions. So let's talk more about the tools. I have a faculty member, and I don't know, you guys might have seen him present before. His name is Mike Nerney, and he still uses an overhead projector. And he uses his overhead projector because he likes to draw. So he puts a transparency on there, and he has a printed transparency with his information, and then he goes along and he draws on his transparency. And I've been trying to convince him that he wants to do webinars with me because I tell him that he can do the exact same thing online. So you can see, I'm going to just circle this on my slide. There's ways you can write on it. There are, you can use the text tool. So I'm going to type something. You can use these tools as you're engaging your participants to highlight things that you want them to know about. There's actually a highlighter that you can use if you want to call attention to something. There's a pointer tool here as well. And again, these are tools that you can use as a producer or as a faculty member. If you'd like to have participants use these tools, I know that sometimes that's appealing, you have to have them all be part of the presenters for the period that they're using that. So it's something you'll want to consider as you're talking to folks about using the drawing tools. All right, and now I'm gonna actually practice for you writing on the slide. So in chat, write about an effective webinar that you've attended and what made it work so well. And while you're writing about that, I'm going to actually take your answers and I'm going to record them over here on the slide itself. Breakout rooms. Yes, we're going to be practicing with those. Interactive polls, absolutely. Clear graphics, yes. Responsive presenter. And the responsive presenter sometimes may not even really be the presenter being responsive. It could be the producer telling the presenter to be responsive. And again, that's one of the reasons why a team approach is really helpful. All right, so you can see here that I've been able to take your responses and kind of record them here. This is like using a flip chart in the classroom with people. And it's a way, again, to re-engage with them and to have them feel like what they're saying is being heard. So asking you to talk in chat and respond to these kinds of questions is one way to move you up the scale of engagement. We know that when we're online, like Joyce said, we want to be talking to people, re-engaging folks every 3 to 5 minutes. And that's one of the reasons why I have more slides here than I might have if I was doing this in the classroom, because I can't use myself as a visual and I can't use myself to hold your attention. I need to do that a different way. And one way to do that is to have a change in visual frequently. And Carrie is actually really backing up my point that it helps a lot to have at least one person who's not speaking who can field questions, which is what Michelle's doing for us now. She's collecting all of our questions in a pod, and I'll be able to answer them as we go along. You know, if Joyce wants to jump in or Michelle wants to jump in also here in chat and respond to folks, I think that's really a helpful way to work as a team. When you're thinking about engaging your audience, you want to think about the size of the audience that you want to engage, because all of these tools that we're talking about don't work with all sizes of audiences. If we had 500 people here today, it would be really hard for me to ask them to respond in chat and then record their answers on my slide. So that's not an activity you choose for that. But in a group like this size, we can do that and we can be more interactive and more engaging. Don't be afraid to have a webinar where you limit your numbers. I know that we all want to do well and we want OJJDP to feel like we're using their money well, but a webinar or an online workshop that's well delivered for 30 people that you can do several times because you want to have a small audience, because you want to have group discussion, and you might even choose not to use voice over IP but use telephone so you can have more audience participation via audio as well. Don't be afraid to do that, because the quality is what's important, I think, and you can do those in addition to those webinars that you do where you have 500 people attending. So you'll want to be thinking about which tools work best for your audience size. So there are 3 basic ways that we engage folks when we're learning online: voice, visuals, and activities. And we're going to talk about each one of these now for just a few minutes. So we have voice and language, and when you don't have yourself as your main visual aid, like you do in the classroom, your voice becomes part of the package that you're offering. So you want to think about these tips. And I'm going to go ahead and read them so you get an idea of how I'm using my voice. In the synchronous environment, your voice is your most important tool. You and your participants won't have the same visual cues as in the classroom. Don't overemphasize or draw attention to the technology. For example, instead of saying, "Jane, I see you have your hand up," recognize the raised hand as you would in the classroom. "Jane, what's your question?" Don't over-apologize for small technical glitches. Rather than commenting on how long a poll is taking to come up for the participants to view, fill in the time with information in anticipation of the question of the poll. And I'm kind of ignoring tip number 2 there a little bit, because I'm telling you a little bit about what we're doing behind the scenes, because I think it'll be of interest to you and your role in the webinars as you move forward developing your own. But normally these are things that, and it's just like if you're in the classroom and you're struggling to get the LCD projector to work, you want your faculty member to be chatting and kind of distracting the audience from the AV. And it's the same thing online. I'm actually going to ask for our folks at NTAC to read these for me. So Michelle and Joyce, you are going to be my volunteers. So Michelle, if you could read the first 2, and Joyce, if you could read the last one for me, I would really appreciate it. I'm going to mute my microphone so that we don't get an echo with their microphone.
Use your hands and gestures while you speak. Though participants won't see you, they will hear you. Hear gestures through your tone and voice intonation. This will improve your delivery. During an online session, reading from your scripted lesson plan can help you remember key points and stay focused on the content. You have a lot to look at and pay attention to, all at the same time.
You also need to focus on your participants. Raise your eyes frequently to look at the screen so you can read comments and questions in the chat from participants and your producer and recognize raised hands.
Go ahead. Great, thank you guys for volunteering. We think that it's really helpful for you to re-engage participants even with just a different voice. That's why you might hear us recommend that you use more than one presenter, because again, a different voice will help you re-engage. Your participants who might have wandered away to check their email will say, "Oh wait, what's this?" and we'll come back to the webinar. And so it's just a way to get people re-engaged. And of course, these tips are really helpful as well. All right, let's talk a little bit about visuals. In the classroom, you are the primary visual, and your PowerPoint is secondary, your videos, they're secondary, it's the presenter. That's what everybody focuses on, and you can make eye contact, and you can really gauge the flow of the room. You don't have the luxury of being your primary visual when you're presenting online. So a lot of folks already use really great visuals in their PowerPoints, and so I think we should emulate them. We want to kick it up a notch when we talk about our visuals. Choose images that make a point about the content and even can add some humor. Like this. You know, this baby, I think you guys might have seen him circulating around, and it's just such a great picture of what is going on here. So it's a great picture to use when you're posing a challenging question, or you want to present something that's maybe going to surprise folks. You could talk about defining family by using a slide that looks like this. And you might want to, but you might also want to use a slide that looks like this or this. All right, we also want to talk about using animation when we talk about using visuals. Slide animation can be a little bit tricky, and sometimes if you've forgotten you've put the animation there, you can click and not have anything happen, or click too far and have to go back. But you can use it effectively. You want to use it in a purposeful way. In this slide animation, we're talking about the dynamics of the force field analysis. And it visually demonstrates that as you increase driving forces to move current behavior toward a more desirable behavior, restraining forces will increase in strength, maintaining an equilibrium and preventing you from making a change. All right, let's talk about graphics as well. Use graphics not only to display information, but also to give your participants an idea of where you are in the presentation. So right now you can see visuals is larger there. That's the part of our presentation that we're talking about now. All right, now we're going to do a video. You want to create an experience for your learners with your video. Right now I'm going to show you a video that I call Crazy Tables, and actually that's what it's called on the internet as well. We're going to, let me drag it a little bit bigger here in the center of the screen. All right, and this is a visual that we're going to use to demonstrate that things aren't always what they seem. Oh. All right, I hope you were all able to see that video. You'll notice that I initially forgot to mute my speakers, but then remembered, so that's an important thing to remember when you're doing a video, is that you want to have the presenter speakers muted so you don't end up with the echo that we've experienced earlier today. The video, I think, is an interesting illustration of what we're looking for when we're doing videos online. It's a video that's easy to do. Even if there's a stutter or a lag on the participant end, there's nothing that's going to be revealed that they wouldn't know otherwise. There's, and it's a short enough video that even if you have a very slow system, you'll be able to see the whole thing before the presenter wants to go back to talking. And I see that Sabrina's saying that the connection cut out and she couldn't see all of the video. One of the things that I always like to do is include the video in an email to folks, or else include it in the handout pod if you have it in a format that's easily downloadable, so that folks, if they do want to see the video, they can get to it. Again, when you're thinking about videos, you don't want something that's going to be hard to watch on the computer. So you don't want anything that's going to be, like, you don't want necessarily a 20-minute video, because you don't know what the capabilities, what the technology capabilities are of your audience. And so you have to plan for folks that are going to even just be on a dial-up connection, who won't necessarily be able to have the bandwidth to see a long video presentation. You don't want anything that's really heavy with a lot of dialogue, because again, if there's a stutter or a lag, that's going to be hard for people to get the point. And so as you're selecting videos, and they can be a very effective tool online, those are some things to think about. All right, let's talk about activities. Because activities, I think, are one of our favorite things to do with people when we have them in front of us. And so today's activity, we're actually going to send you off into breakout rooms. And you're going to have a short group discussion. So the breakout rooms can be used, even when you're using voice over IP like we are. You won't be able to talk to each other, but you'll be able to chat to each other. I'm going to assign you to breakout rooms now. We have 3 breakout rooms with 6 folks in each. In each breakout room, I'm going to ask one person to serve as the recorder. If you're the recorder in your breakout room, I'd like you to summarize the discussion and then be able to share it with the rest of us in chat here in the primary presentation window. So I'm going to assign our recorders now, and then I will give you instructions about what to do in the breakout room. All right, so in breakout room 1, Alexis, if you could serve as our recorder. And if you could write in chat if you would be willing to do so, that'd be great. In breakout room 2, Alicia, can you please be our recorder? And in breakout room 3, Bill, would you be the recorder? Okay, Alexis says yes. Oh. Bill says as long as you don't expect too much. I don't. And Alicia, yes, thank you. All right, so in the breakout room, what I want you to talk about via chat with the other folks in the breakout room is your favorite classroom activity and how you think you could use that same favorite classroom activity online. So just type a few things. One of the classroom activities that I know folks like to use is sometimes like the values question, where you say, you know, do you agree or disagree with this statement, to get an idea. You can have people stand up or you can have them raise their hand. Doing something like a values exercise, you can use the green check mark and the red X. And so if people agree that ice cream is tasty, then they would all put the green check mark. But if they don't agree with that statement, they'd use the red X. And so that's a classroom activity that we do frequently that you could also do online. So in the breakout rooms, again, you're going to chat about that. You'll have 5 minutes to do that. And our 3 recorders will be summarizing the discussion. And when they come back, they're going to put in chat what you talked about. And then I'll put it up on a discussion pad, so we'll have it there for everybody to see like we were in the front of the room. All right, so I'm going to start the breakout rooms now. You'll be getting a broadcast message from me partway through the breakout rooms to give you like a 2-minute warning, and then we'll bring everybody back into the main room. All right, so I'm pressing the Start Breakout button now. You'll be going to a breakout room with just the other 5 people who have been assigned to your breakout room. Here we go. Okay, folks, you should be back from the breakout rooms now. Okay, good. People are typing. That means you're all here. It gets kind of lonely sitting in the main presentation room when there's nobody else there. If we were using telephones instead of voice over IP, when you go to the breakout rooms, you'd actually have the ability to just talk with the people that you have in your breakout room. And so it's one of the choices you make when you're thinking about how you're setting up your webinar, whether or not you want to be able to have the participants interact in that way. And Sabrina, that's a great question. We could have folks come into the webinar to lead, or into the breakout room to lead the chat discussion. It wasn't something I had thought about, but I think that's a really good idea. I know that I can send myself into each one of the breakout rooms to do a check-in with folks, like you would do when you had people working in small groups at tables in your classroom, and you walk around and kind of listen in and offer suggestions. But the idea, especially when we have enough folks like we did today, to send one person into each group is a really good one. So that's something I'll have to think about. All right, so if we could have our recorders just quickly give us an idea of what they talked about. All of you can type at the same time because that's the beauty of the chat pod. And I'm going to pull up a notes pod. Discussion notes are a little bit different than typing on the slide. You can actually see my typing in real time. And it's a little bit different than the whiteboard, which is also an option here. So this is just one way for us to record conversations and be able to look at it as a larger group. I'm interested about this physical activity bike riding video. And open-ended questions. Always a good idea when you're talking with groups. Role-playing activities. Live demos. Tell stories. Yeah, telling stories, I think, is one of our most powerful training tools, whether we're in person or online. I think online, because we can't see our audience, we sometimes think that the story won't have the same impact that it would if we're in person. But I think it's a really great way to engage people. People love to hear stories from their presenters. Feedback. Yeah, we're really excited that you guys worked in the breakout room and that the breakout room actually worked. You know, when you talk about the different tools in Adobe Connect and how they work, I think the breakout room is maybe one of the ones that's more intimidating than some of the other things. You know, a poll, that's not so scary, but sending your participants away from you to talk without you and not having a way to really control that can be intimidating. But if you practice with it and you spend some time and you think about some of these suggestions, and it's really great to have the participants like Sabrina who are willing to come up with other ideas and brainstorm. I think they can be a really powerful way to get folks talking. And again, this is not something you'd use when you had 500 people, but it can be really useful, I would say, even with groups of 50 or smaller. All right. I'm going to go ahead and hide this pod. Oh, how difficult is it to set up the structure, and how difficult is it to send participants to the room? It's not difficult at all. Adobe Connect actually comes with all of that functionality built in. So on my end of things, in the participant pod where I can see the list of everybody who's attending, which we haven't shown to you today, but it's something that you can let your participants see, there is a choice to set up the breakout rooms. And what I did is I selected distribute our participants equally to the breakout rooms. Because there's 18 of you, it sent 6 of you to 3 different breakout rooms. So it was very easy. And then to launch the breakout room, I just pushed a button. I didn't go in and set up the breakout rooms ahead of time. I know there was a suggestion to maybe go and put the question in on the whiteboard in the breakout room. That would have been a really helpful thing to do. And so thinking about what the breakout room looks like from the participant point of view is really helpful. And so that would have been then something we would have done before we started the webinar for you to have. But the whole setting up of the breakout rooms took me about 20 seconds because I pushed the one button and then I pushed the other button. It's not a hard thing to do. It's just a scary feeling that your participants are not where you can see them or even hear them then in this case. Can we choose breakout rooms where people want to go by discipline? That's an interesting question. I think you can ask people to select, but what they're going to have to do is they wouldn't be able to put themselves in the breakout room. You'd have to have it set up so that they told you which discipline they were in via chat, and then you would put them into that breakout room. So you'd say breakout room 1 is for judges, breakout room 2 is for probation officers, then that's what you'd have on your back end. And then when you had somebody in chat say, oh, I'm a judge, then you would assign them to that breakout room. The way to assign people to breakout rooms is, again, when you have the participant list pod, you would drag their names into the assigned breakout room. And let me see, Michelle, is there a way for you to get that the participant list back over so the participants could see it as well? And George, yes, we could have the producer set up the breakout rooms while I continue to present. Today, I'm actually, there are 3 levels of functionality in Adobe Connect. You have your host, which is the person who can do everything. You have your presenters, which have access to most things, and then you have the participant level. So Michelle and the other folks at NTTAC are always going to be hosts so that they can do all of these different things. They can hide things from you or they can show things to you, and they can set up and do the breakout rooms. And actually today, because I was going to be running the breakout rooms, they made me a host so I can do that as well. If you have a webinar that you're doing and you have a presenter who wants to do breakout rooms, but you don't necessarily want to make them a host, you yourself then would be the host and you would set up the breakout rooms for them, and the presenter would just do the chatting. All right, do we have other questions coming in? And Michelle, if you could share questions that have come in. So Carrie's asking, is it still easy to set up when you have lots of attendees? And again, the breakout room, I think, is not as effective when you have a lot of attendees. You can do a number of breakout rooms. I believe you can have up to 10 breakout rooms. And so if you have a really experienced team and you have a clear idea about what you want to be happening in the breakout room, you might be able to do it with groups above 50, but again, that's just one of those things that's harder to do because it's harder to manage. So I'm going to pull over the attendee list here. You guys should be able to see that now. This is a list of everybody who's here, and you can see that we have our hosts up there at the top and then all of the participants. So I could actually drag participants into specific rooms if I needed to. And it's just, again, another way to assign them to breakout rooms if you needed to do it by like discipline, for example. Now I'm going to move them back out of your line of sight. we've got a lot of folks still typing, so I'm going to just wait a few minutes to see what's coming up. And then we're going to wrap up, and it looks like we're going to be right on time, which is always a good thing. So George says he's seen webinars with large numbers of attendees, and they often don't ask questions. Any suggestions to engage the whole group? And again, I think when you have 80, anytime you get above about 50, you've got to think about the ways you want to engage people. I think you can still use the raised hand icon and the green check mark, the red X, the raised hand. All of those things are ways that you can ask people questions, even if you have a big group of people. So that way you don't have maybe necessarily 70 answers coming into chat, but it's still a way to get people to be engaged. You can also use a poll, of course, is a really easy way to do that. You can do things where you have people, if you don't want to do breakout rooms, you can still have people do like private chats with each other to have like a one-on-one conversation. If that's something that would be where you want to just have two people talk about a topic, that's a way to do that. And Dawn's asking, can breakout rooms be configured for exercises? Yes. Where you can have each room have a different task, absolutely. And again, it's all about how you give that direction, and I like the idea of going into the breakout room and putting those directions on the whiteboard, and then maybe even using a member of the production team to guide those discussions. And so it would be very easy to have people go in and discuss, like if you've sent them an article to read ahead of time, and you want each group to read different sections or to discuss different sections of the article, or you want to have them each talk about a different question and then come back and report out to the big group. And that's where it becomes really helpful to do those discussion pods. So once somebody has had that conversation in a breakout room and they come to report out to the big group, it's really helpful to capture those things on the discussion pod and have it there in the main window for everybody to see. Sometimes it's hard for everybody to sort of follow what's going on in chat. All right, we have time for maybe one more question, and then we want to have general questions also about the webinar as a whole. And then we're going to let OJJDP have a few final words. And one thing I didn't mention, but that you probably have noticed, is that you shouldn't be afraid of silence when you're doing a webinar. You don't want to have long periods of silence, but when you're waiting for folks to ask questions, like I am now, it's okay to be quiet. That's not a thing that I do well. I want to fill the silence, but it's okay to just let the quiet sit. Right, no humming, no singing the Battle Hymn of the Republic to yourself. All right, Michelle, well, it doesn't look like we have any more questions coming in, so I'm turning it over to you.
Wow, Jessica. Could you have fit one more thing in there? Awesome job. Let's see the hand claps for Jessica. Thanks so much, Jessica. Yeah, hand claps, hands claps. Great job. You know, and I so appreciate you all tuning in today and staying the course, because you can't tell me you didn't get a lot of information from this 90-minute webinar. I know you did, and we appreciate the time and the attention that you gave to both Joyce and Jessica. One thing I want to leave with you all is there were about 53%, Joyce, I think I recall, that said that, you know, you're just kind of waiting and that you might need some support to actually produce, plan, and implement a webinar. We certainly would love for you to use your chat window right now and tell us what you would need to roll out your first webinar and how we perhaps could help you do that. So if you would just take to the chat window and let us know that. And while you're doing that, and before I turn it over to Linda Rosen to close us out here, I just want to tell you a couple things that we've gotten from the feedback form from folks that they do like or they don't like, just really quickly. We provide a feedback form after every webinar, and we read that information, and it provides us a lot of good information about how we should move forward to the next webinar. Folks want the PowerPoint in advance to take notes on. They want the PowerPoint. They have to have it. It's just a must. They don't want you to waste a lot of time introducing the panel. They figure they can read a bio somewhere else. So don't spend a lot of time with introductions of your panelists. They want a clean, clear, and concise PowerPoint, one that's free enough for them to take notes on. And remember, you know the content, so it's not important for you to put everything on your slide. Definitely no reading of the slides. Snooze, it's a big bore when people tune in to hear your subject matter expertise, but yet you're reading from a slide. They love a Q&A. Everyone wants their question answered. Not one, not two, but all their questions. So if you're going to have a 90-minute webinar, ensure that you allow enough time to respond to as many questions as possible in a variety of different ways. You can have a Q&A after each presenter, or you can wait till the end, although I find that people want their questions answered sooner than later. And then, of course, the other issue is too many presenters. Remember, the rule of thumb for 90 minutes is a 3-person panel. So there's some tips. You've certainly got some good tools and opportunities to be interactive and engaging when you roll out your first webinar. But again, let us hear from you. So thank you. Linda?
Well, everybody, thank you so much for participating. I just want to add one thing to what Michelle had to say, and that is also that we collect the questions that have not been answered on the live webinar, and we have the presenters respond to them afterwards, and that's also really appreciated. It may take a few weeks because we have to get the information back from the presenters and then edit it and get it up on the website. But it's archived and it's there for posterity. And anyway, on behalf of OJJDP, I'd like to thank you all again, especially our presenters, Joyce and Jenny. It was a great diversity of very useful information. Thank you so much. And our producer and host, NTAC, Michelle Duhart-Tong, and also our tech specialist, Callie Long, who you didn't get to meet earlier, but she's here typing away in her computer. I also like you to know that we've formed a TTA Provider Network working group, webinar working group. We meet periodically by phone conference, and we share techniques, technology, ideas, concerns surrounding webinars. And one of the things that we came up with when people were looking to change webinar platforms because contracts were ending, we got to share information. Michelle was especially helpful on sharing things that they'd learned about the cost and the different components that each webinar platform offered. So that's one of the things that we do. And if you'd like to be involved in our webinar working group, please email Michelle, and her email address is mduhart, D-U-H-A-R-T -Tong, T-O-N-G, @ntac.org. Thank you so much.